Hey everybody, hope you're all having a fantastic week. As we come to our lesson today, we're going to be looking today at the story of Jesus' arrest and his trial. We're going to see Peter's going to deny him 3 times as well in this passage. So as we go through and as we look, we're going to see that Jesus was facing death. He goes to this olive grove on the side of the Kidron Valley, and he goes there to find this place to pray. In other Gospels, we see him going there and praying as well for this cup to pass from him. So we kind of have each Gospel kind of has a different view of this, and we'll kind of see some of the things in here, some of the things that maybe not in the other ones that are in this one, as well as some other things. So as we go through and as we look through this, let's be, just looking at this, because you know what, Easter, to be honest with you, Easter is coming up in April anyways, and we're towards the end of February. So, we're getting towards the time whenever we're going to start looking at this a little deeper anyways in church. And so I think it's great for us to go ahead and kind of get a look at this and see the story of all of this unfolding before our eyes. And so we'll read beginning with in John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. And then we'll see this as well. So John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Jews who betrayed him also knew this place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all this would happen to him, came forward and said to him, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," he drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me?" So in here, we kind of see this impressions of the garden that we see. This is on the Mount of Olives. He's there. He's on the other side of the brook Kidron in the Kidron Valley, and he's preparing his disciples. He's gone there many times with them, met with them. This was a place that they could probably get away from people, to have some privacy, to discuss things that were going on, to discuss what was happening, to discuss issues, and to train these men to be prepared to go and to tell others about Christ, to go and to spread his word and to teach them what they needed to. And so that's what we see here, and that's where we find our setting for this first part of this story, the first part of this narrative. And that's what we see. We see Jesus is there, and he's preparing, he's ready to go. His final days here on this earth are coming to an end. He's preparing to go to the cross. And he knows what is coming. He knows what's happening, and he knows what is going on. And so the thing is that these men come with Judas. Judas had somehow procured this band to come with him, these people to come with him to arrest Jesus. So Judas was there. He was prepared. In other passages, it says that he went and he identified Jesus with a kiss. We don't see that part of it in this passage, but that doesn't mean that that's not true in other passages in other passages where we see that. And so what that means is that John omitted that detail of this night. He made this detail for whatever reason. We don't know. But it's not in here. And so that doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that John decided not to focus on that part of this story, that part of this narrative. And so we see here is that Jesus comes forth, and he does something that's amazing if you think about it. They come and they're seeking Jesus. They're seeking him. Jesus comes forth and he says, "Well, who do you seek? Who are you seeking?" But of course, Jesus knew who they were seeking. He knew everything. He was prepared for what was going to happen. He was prepared to go to the cross. He was prepared for all those things. Yet, he knew that they were there for him. But then yet he still asked, who are you here for? Who are you here for? That's an interesting story. And Jesus always did things in an interesting way, in a different way than we would normally think about. But Jesus goes and he says there, and then they say, oh, we're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. We're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. And then he says, well, I am he. It's me. I'm the one you're seeking. And then we see the reactions of the guards. If you look at verse 4 through 9, it's really interesting when you see that. And it says, when Jesus said to them, I am he, said they drew back and fell on the ground. That's a very interesting part of the story. Is that when he identified himself as Jesus, they came back and they fell on the ground. We don't know why they did that. It doesn't really explain the passage. There's different people who believe different things about that. But some of the interesting ones probably the ones that are the most accurate that I read, was I read one passage where it's talked about one person where he said they were just shocked that he would admit it. Because think about it. Jesus knew what was happening, right? And if someone was coming and asking for someone by name, they may not identify themselves. Or, think about this. If you always see this sometimes, and you maybe see this in movies and TV shows and things like that. Whenever someone calls and asks for someone, they say, oh, well, what is it about? To try to figure out what's going on before they identify themselves, to see if it's something good. Well, no, instead of doing that, which is like our human nature, which is to do our own thing and to seek after our own thing and to do that, Jesus sits here and he identifies himself as the person they're looking for. He has accepted the cup. He's accepted God's will for his life. He's accepted the mission that God has told him that he's going to do. He accepts that. And he's accepted that. In other passages we see, like I mentioned earlier, he said he prayed for this cup to pass before with him if it's God's will, but yet it wasn't God's will. It was God's will for this cup to stay on him. And so he did. It stayed on him. And he knew it was coming, so he just accepted it. He didn't fight it. And here we see he didn't fight it at all. And then his reaction, we see this, is we see Jesus say it's him, and then he goes on, and he wants his disciples to go free. He wants his disciples to go free. And that was for, as it mentioned, as we looked at a couple weeks ago, he said that, so the prophecy would be fulfilled that not one of them has he lost. The only one he ended up losing was Judas, but that was Judas chose that. Jesus didn't lose anybody. No one left because of Jesus. And so we see that and we understand that at that point. Is Jesus is here. He admits who he is. He's ready to turn himself over to them so that they can go and so that he can start fulfilling his purpose in coming to earth. So that he can go to the cross, so that he can go to save his people from their sins. That's what he came for, and that's what he was here to do. And that's what he was preparing to do, is to go to the cross. So that he could be that sacrifice for us. So that he would be the perfect sacrifice for our sins. And he was ready to go, and ready to go peacefully. He wasn't going to make a fuss. He wasn't going to fight. He wasn't going to run, which they probably thought he was going to do. And that may be why they fell back and they fell down, because they realized what was going on. They were just taken back by what he said. They were surprised and shocked. I'm sure we've all been shocked and surprised at some point in our lives when something goes on. Maybe something happens and you're shocked. I think back, really, to be honest with you, thinking back even just yesterday. Holly and I were going somewhere. We were going to the church that we came from. They were doing a special meal. So we were going to it so we could catch up with some people, things like that. And so Holly needed to stop at Ulta at the Ashboro Mall on the way. And so I was like, okay, so we left a few minutes early just so we could make sure that we got there on time. So we get there. My intention was to drop her off, drive around, and wait for her. But yet, whenever we got there was a spot open in the front. So everything was working out, and everything with God, that Jesus was working out exactly as he had planned. Exactly as he wanted. He was preparing for this. And so we see that in this story, is that he was prepared for everything to go on. Everything was going according to his plan. Everything went right. Everything was fulfilled. The disciples were taken back because, the people were taken back. They were shocked, just like I was shocked whenever I got that parking space that was right up front, so that I didn't have to drive around, so that it would be easy, quick in and out. I was shocked. I was taken back by that, and that's what was happening with them. They were taken back by that. I still, that never happens for whenever we've ever gone out anywhere, that something like that has happened and worked out perfectly. But we were taken back by it. It wasn't like we were just surprised. We were shocked. We were kind of in awe of that, and that's what the people that were coming to arrest him were. They were just in awe of the fact that this man was admitting to what he was doing. This man was admitting to being Jesus, because you got to remember, the religious leaders of the day had been seeking after him forever. Time and time again, they tried to seek after him, and he got away. And now all of a sudden, he's admitting to this. Now all of a sudden, he's admitting he's ready, he's prepared to go and to do this. And that's where we find Jesus in our story. And that's where we find what happened here, is that the people were taken back. But then Peter, once again, I know we talked about this the other week, but Peter, the disciple who sometimes has a habit of not thinking before he acts, not thinking before he speaks, does this same kind of thing. So Peter goes and cuts the servant's ear, and cuts off one of the guards' right ear. And Jesus has to correct him. Jesus says, "It's my time, it's my cup. Shall I not drink of the cup my Father has given me? Shall I not fulfill my Father's will for me?" is what Jesus is saying in this passage. That's what he's saying. He's saying, should I not fulfill the will that my Father has for me? And so that's where Peter finds himself. And then it doesn't mention it here, but Jesus does heal the guard's ear. He puts his ear back together. So that's perfect. And so we see that. And so once again, these guards, they see this miracle that happens. And so, they may be taken back by that as well once they see this happening. And then we really start to see this next section, which is actually two sections. We're going to kind of skip. We're going to read one part of it and another part of it. So we're not going to read sequentially through here. But we're going to read a couple verses, verses 12 to 18, and then verses 25 to 27. This passage, it really talks about Peter and how Peter denied Christ. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Remember, I think it was 2 chapters ago in chapter 16, Peter was told by Jesus that he would deny Jesus 3 times. That he would deny Jesus 3 times. And Peter, being the man that he is, was like, pretty much, no, that's not going to happen. But once again, Peter sticks his foot in his mouth. Peter oversteps. Peter does things that no one else that he didn't think. And so he comes, and then we see what really happens here in this. And we see Peter denying Christ 3 times in 2 different places here. So what we're going to do is we're going to read, as I mentioned, verses 12 to 18 of chapter 18, and then verses 25 to 27. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus and did so, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door, so the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servant and officers had made charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. Now let's go down to verse 25 to 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied again. Peter again denied it and at once a rooster crowed. Here we see Peter in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right? He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because Jesus was so well known, you got to remember that they just came and went through so many different things. Many people came down at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and were putting down palm leaves for him to walk on. And his disciples would have been following him. His disciples would have been seen, would have been known by people. Would have been known by people there. So that's why they say, hey, weren't you one of him? Weren't you one of him? We see that first, right? The servant girl who's at the door, who lets people in and out, recognized Peter and said, hey, aren't you one of the disciples? And Peter said, no, I'm not one. Why would Peter do that? Peter had spent the past couple years with Jesus, day in, day out, seeing Jesus work, seeing Jesus perform miracles, seeing Jesus do great and mighty things. Yet, he denied Jesus at this point. He denied Jesus at this point. Because guess what? It was easier for him to deny Jesus and not suffer than it was for him to claim Jesus and then face possible persecution, face arrest, face going through what Jesus was going through right now. So Peter decided at this point that this wasn't going to happen, that this wasn't what he needed to do. Later on, he changes his mind. Later on, he becomes one of the foundations of the church. He's one of the pillars. He's one of the founding men of the church, of the early church. He's one of the faithful men and women who built the church, who went and told others about Christ. And he had a great and mighty ministry. And later he was killed for his beliefs. He never denied Christ after this moment. He always accepted Christ. And that was a change for him. That was a change. He had a change of heart at this point because he knew that he had Christ in him. And so he was changed after this moment. So we see that, right? He's outside, and Peter was at the door. And so another disciple, we don't have that name, but he was known to the high priest, so he was able to go in and out of the high priest area. And so he tried to get Peter in, and that's whenever Peter was first recognized. That's whenever Peter was first recognized. So at this point, it was cold. So they lit a fire because guess what? They didn't have heat. They didn't have like what we have today. So they had to light a fire so that they would be warm. Light a fire so that they could have warmth. And then they were standing around it warming it. And then one of the other men, someone comes to them and says, twice around the fire, right? We see this 2 times around this fire, Peter denies Christ. They said to him, aren't you one of his disciples? And he denied it. The second time it got a little more specific. It was interesting because we see this here and we see someone's mentioned. It was a relative of the person whose ear was cut off. So here it is. Peter cut off this person's ear in the garden, right? Malchus in the garden. One of his relatives who probably heard about what was going on because guess what? Just like it is today, gossip and things that happen spread rapidly. And that's what was happening here. This was spreading rapidly so that people would know what was going on, so that people would have heard. So that, it's very possible that everyone within the circle of the temple, everyone within the circle of these proceedings that were going on right now, this questioning of Jesus within this courtyard, would have known that Peter cut off this person's ear, and that Malchus's ear was put back on in a miracle by Jesus. And so we see that and we get to understand that some. And so this relative asked, didn't I see you with the garden? Because it's very possible that this relative was with Malchus in the garden and actually saw him go and use his sword to cut his ear off. Now, you got to remember, once again, it wasn't light. They didn't have artificial light like we have, where we have lights outside to see. So they would have been using their torches and other things. So it could have been kind of iffy, but he may not have fully recognized it, but he thought he looked familiar. And so he asked him, and then Peter has this opportunity. To say yes, and he doesn't. He has this opportunity to correct the other 2 denials and to do this, but yet he doesn't. And just imagine this: the rooster crows, and we see just picture this. The rooster crows, and Peter, what Jesus told Peter in the upper room just a few hours earlier comes to mind. This rooster crows, and he's like, I've denied Jesus 3 times. He realizes what's going on, and he is ashamed. He's ashamed of what happened. We don't read that in our passage, but you can just imagine what would happen. Sometimes we have these things in our mind, or we're told something, and then whenever something happens, we remember what we're told. I can just imagine that's what was going on through Peter's mind. What was happening to Peter is that he realized and he remembered that one phrase that Jesus said is that before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me. Before the rooster crows, you'll deny me. The rooster crows, and Peter just remembers, I just denied Christ 3 times. Changing and doing that. And so Peter denies Jesus. And he gives the wrong answer for the wrong reasons. Once again, he gives this answer to protect himself instead of just standing up for what's right. And that's how we are in our society many times. We're afraid to say we're a Christian. We're afraid to put on social media we're a Christian. We're afraid to tell our friends at school that we're a Christian because we're afraid of what they're going to say. We're afraid of what's going to happen to us. And that's what happens in this time, right? This is what's happening with Peter. He's afraid of what's going to happen. And so he gives the wrong answer for the wrong reason. He gives the wrong answer to protect himself. Whenever he could have had that opportunity to correct the issues, to not deny Jesus, to stay true to Jesus, and to admit that he was one of Jesus' disciples. And instead of saving himself, proclaim Jesus. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen at some point in our society, I believe, is we're going to get to the point where we're going to have to, as Christians, make a stand. It's either going to have to be we deny Christ and protect ourselves, or we claim Christ and we face persecution. We face death threats. We face all of these different things. But yet, that's going to happen in our society. It's not happening here in America yet, but I just have a feeling that at some point it is going to happen. We are going to face persecution. We are going to face these challenges and these questions where we're going to have to choose between self-preservation or God. Self-preservation or claiming Jesus. And that's going to come. And that's what Peter was doing. Peter decided to claim self-preservation instead of claiming Jesus. Instead of claiming the one who had trained him, the one who had taught him, the one who was preparing, as he would have known, to go to the cross to die for our sins. That's who Peter, and that's what we're going to have to do at some point. And maybe we're already doing that at some point. Maybe at school, maybe at work, maybe as you grow up, you're going to face these situations where maybe you're not going to face persecution, but you face a challenge to do something. To face a challenge to be tempted to sin, to be tempted to do these things that go against what the Bible says, or be cool, be accepted. Which one are you going to do? Are you going to choose what the Bible says? Are you going to choose what your biblical belief says? Are you going to choose Jesus? Or are you going to choose these things so you can be cool, so you can be so you can be accepted by people? I pray that you choose the right thing. I pray that you choose the right thing. I pray that if we ever are under persecution here in America, that you choose the right thing. But yet, sometimes we won't know until we get in those situations how we would choose, how we would react. And that's where we find ourselves. Is Peter denied Jesus by the fire twice and at the door of the temple. He denied Jesus whenever he could have taken that opportunity to go and to claim to be Christ, to claim to be a part of Christ. The story may be different. But yet he didn't do that. He chose the wrong answer for the wrong reasons. He chose self-preservation over serving God. And we see what happens. And we see that, he does this, and then I'm sure that he felt guilty. I'm sure that he felt horrible about this because he realized Jesus was right. Jesus told him that this was going to happen. And he probably, in his mind, was like, oh, that's never going to happen. Because that's what happens with our parents, right? Our parents tell us, oh, if you do this, this is going to happen. And then, maybe we do it and then it doesn't happen. And we do it again, it doesn't happen. Then we do it again, it happens. And then we remember, oh yeah, my parents told me not to do this. My parents told me this was unsafe. My parents told me that I shouldn't be doing this. But you did it anyways. That's just what Peter did. Peter knew what was coming, and he decided to deny Christ. And the rest is history. And that's what we see. So now what we're going to do is, as we move along, we're going to move into starting to the questions of this. And we kind of see there, and we kind of heard this person talk a little bit earlier, because we talked about in verses 12 to 14, which we really kind of didn't discuss. It just mentions some names in there. Because it mentions Annas and Caiaphas. And Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the chief priest that year. So I don't know if it was like they held elections or what they did to choose the high priest for that year. Or maybe it was like an appointed position amongst the priests, that they're the high priest this year to be in charge of all the festivals and anything that goes on this year, to kind of spread the responsibility around. But we see this is that, and it was, so Jesus was Caiaphas was, preparing the Jews and was telling them that it would be good for Jesus to die for this. And so we see this. So now we're going to go to the questioning part, which is, we're going to read verses 19 to 24. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in temples where our Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? And those who have heard me, what I've said to them, they know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answered the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So here we start to see Jesus being questioned. Jesus is being questioned. He's being questioned. At this point, it's going to be several people that are going to hand him off. So it's kind of like he's going through the court system of the day. So kind of like today, if you have a grievance with somebody, or you have a lawsuit that you bring against somebody, or we see this all the time, right? Is you have different levels. You have, depending on the situation, you'll go to like your local federal court, then you'll go to more like a higher court, and then you'll end up ultimately at the Supreme Court. And that's what's happening here, is that there's different levels. And that's what we see first whenever he comes to Annas. Annas is kind of the first level of the court system. Maybe he's like the court clerk, and they bring him in kind of to figure out what's going on. Because we see, and it's very interesting if you looked at it, because you see at the end of that, in verse 24, it says, and Annas sent him to the high priest, right? Sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So the Jewish religious leaders had these this hierarchy within their judicial system that they had, and it ultimately, I think, what it ended up being is that no one really wanted to take on the responsibilities for this. No one wanted to be this person who was going to kill the Messiah. So it ended up getting to Pilate eventually, who was the highest level of the court system in that day, in that area. And it was up to him. And that's where it gets to next. And we'll read that here. But yeah, we read this and we see some interesting things in this whenever he's questioned here in these 5 verses right here. So, Jesus asked, well, why are you questioning me? And Jesus answered and said that they answered him about his teaching, and he was honest with him. He said, you know what? I've gone into the temples. I've gone to where all the Jews are at, and I've taught openly. He said, I've always taught in the Jewish synagogues and Gentiles. And synagogues and temples. He's never done anything in secret. He never had his own kind of quiet meetings to overthrow the religious leaders of the day. So Jesus is defending himself. He's telling what's really happening and what really happened, right? So we see that here. That's what Jesus is doing. Jesus is explaining his ministry to them. He's explaining what's going on, what's happening, how it's coming to pass. And what he did, he says, you know what? I haven't tried to do anything in secret. Everything I've done openly so that anyone would know. Any Jew was welcome to hear. Any Jew was welcome to understand what was happening at this moment. And that's what we see in this passage here, right? Jesus was doing that. And then he said, after he did those things, he said, you know, then why are you asking me? Why don't you ask those who've heard? Why don't you go ask some of those that have come that have followed me? Some of those that are following me, go ask them what I've done. Go ask them the message that I've talked about. And that's what Jesus says there. And whenever he did that, he's like, you know, well, why are you questioning me? Ask those that have heard me what I said. They know what I said. And when he said these things, one of the officers hit him. He struck him, I guess because he thought he was being smart. He thought he was being out of line, or as we would say, in contempt of court at that point. Right? We've all seen court TV shows, and we kind of know that that's what they do at certain times, is they may hold you in contempt if you don't follow the rules of the court. And maybe that's what he wasn't doing. We don't know. But he was saying these things. He's like, well, why do you strike me? I tell the truth. He says, if what I said was wrong, bring witnesses against me. Bring people in here that will say otherwise. Bring people in here that will prove that I didn't do this. But instead, they didn't, and they just had to depend on what Jesus was saying. So we see that here it comes to this point where he says that, and Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now, in John's gospel, we don't have an account of what happened, because it goes straight from this to the section that we read earlier about Peter denying Christ. And then it goes to Jesus coming before Christ. We'll see that here in a second, because we'll see Caiaphas was in this as well, in this next story. But it's kind of interesting how this whole hierarchy kind of works out, because Annas sent him to Caiaphas, who was right before Peter's in the governor's headquarters. So we see in verses 28 through 32. We'll read this real quick, and because it kind of goes along with our story that we just the part that we just read. It says, and they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's house. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusations do you bring against this man? They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own laws. And the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So here, for whatever reason, and it could have been that since the Jews weren't supposed to be killing anybody, the Jews really didn't have the authority from the Roman government to be able to do that at this point. Because at this point, we have to remember, is that Israel was under control of the Roman Empire. Right? So the Roman Empire was in control. Pilate was a Roman who was there. He was there to oversee, and kind of like the governor that was in charge of the area at this time. And so they bring him to his house. So they led him from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. So all we really know about Caiaphas is that he was the high priest that year. So we really don't see the account here of his trial, with Jesus' trial with Caiaphas. And so now what we're going to do is we see that he's brought before Pilate. He's brought before Pilate, and the charges are laid against him. Right? So they go to the governor's house, and they can't go into the governor's house because it would be considered unclean for them to go. And this was Passover, so they couldn't partake of the Passover if they did anything unclean or anything that went against their laws, the Jewish laws. And so they find themselves at the doorstep there. And I think we've talked about this before. We talked about how that the Jewish laws, they always tried to find ways around things so that they wouldn't break the law. And whenever you have to do that, it becomes not so much something that is probably should be followed, if you get my drift. You come up with all these things and all these things to get around this. I think one time I mentioned I was watching this home improvement show, and they were building this house for this Jewish couple, remodeling this house for this Jewish couple. And on the Sabbath, which is Saturday for the Jews. Remember, Saturday instead of Sunday. So on Saturday, they weren't allowed to do any work. Well, they considered flipping a light switch on and off work. But they could have it on a timer, so it automatically came on, automatically went off, so that they could have light in their house. So those are the kind of things that happen in Jewish culture. That was happening in Jewish culture back here, and even in modern day Jewish culture, that allows them to kind of abide by the law, but to enjoy certain things, enjoy certain aspects of modern society. And so we see this here, is that they couldn't go into the governor's house because they didn't want to be unclean. They couldn't kill somebody because that would go against their law as well. And so they were turning over to the Romans because the Romans had no problems in sacrificing people and killing people and doing corporal punishment. And so that's where we find ourselves here. So they did that, and they took him to his house. And Jesus was going to reveal death by crucifixion. And we'll look at that in the next chapter. And we'll go more in depth in that as well. Now we're going to read verses 33 to 40, which is the last part of this, which is right up until Jesus was preparing to be crucified. So we're going to read verses 33 to 40. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And he said this. He went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So here, and once again, in reading different narratives and different perspectives of this in the other Gospels, we kind of have different blank spots that get filled in at times. And so that's why we have this, we see a lot of times these stories of what happens, and it's pulled from multiple different passages to kind of put together an overall view of what was happening to Jesus. And as we get closer to Easter, we'll look at a devotion that kind of goes day by day what Jesus' last 10 days looked like. But we see here is that, so he's brought before Pilate, and Pilate brings him in and starts to question him. Right? Jesus is like, "Why are you here? Your own nation delivered you to them." And he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And, Jesus goes and he answers him. He says, "Did they tell you that, or do you know?" And he goes back and forth with Pilate, and I'm sure it's not a heated confrontation, but he's trying to explain to Pilate what's going on. Pilate wasn't a Jew. Pilate was a Roman. Pilate was Roman. He was there to control the territory, to be in charge of the territory. He was the governor of the territory there, and so he has the ultimate say in what goes on and what happens. And so he's going back and forth. He's trying to understand, because he's like, "Well, what have you done that you have so infuriated the Jews?" is in essence what he asks. He tries to figure that out. He's trying to understand, why are you here? Why did they bring you to me right now? Why is this such an urgent matter that is brought to me? And he doesn't fully understand it. And I don't think Pilate fully understood. Once again, he's not a Jew. He wasn't accustomed to Jewish. He was used to some Jewish customs, but he didn't fully study the Jewish history. He didn't know the Old Testament. He didn't know the prophecies about the Messiah. But yet, here we see this. He's answering to him. And he says, he says, what have you done that your own nation of the chief priests have delivered you over to me? He asks Jesus if he's the king of the Jews. And Jesus goes into this part about how that his kingdom is not here on earth. He said, if it was, my people would come and they would save me. But yet, my kingdom is not here. My kingdom, and he's trying to tell Pilate that his kingdom is in heaven. His kingdom is not part of this earth. It's a different kind of thing, and trying to explain that to him. And Jesus said, you say that I'm king. He says, for this purpose I was born, right? So Pilate, once again, is confused. He asks, is you king? And Jesus says, yeah, for as king, this purpose I've come to this world, to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who listens to the truth hears my voice. Listens to my voice. And Pilate is trying to understand. Pilate is trying to understand what's going on so that he can make a decision for what's going to happen. And he went back to the Jews and he said, you know what? I find no guilt in this man. I don't find anything wrong with this man. He doesn't seem to have done anything wrong. He doesn't seem to be lying. I understand where he's coming from. I understand what's happening. Why are you warning him? Why did you bring him to me? And then, so I think to kind of get them off of them, he said, okay, well, you have this tradition that we would release one person for Passover. For your Passover, we would release one person from prison. And he said, do you want to choose this man? And then he said, no, they chose Barabbas. They yelled, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. They would rather have this robber come out and be released from prison than to have Jesus out. And Jesus would ultimately go to the cross and be buried. And the Jewish leaders of that day chose to crucify and kill Jesus. They were the ones who did that. It wasn't Pilate. Pilate fulfilled it for them, yes. But the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, the people that were there at Pilate's doorstep, by saying, give us Barabbas. We want Barabbas. They're the ones who chose for Jesus to go. But yet Jesus was in control of this whole time. Jesus was in control of all the events related to his death and resurrection. So he knew what to say. He knew what to do. He knew what was going to happen. And he was in control. That's one of the principles we can learn from this passage. Is that, Jesus was in control of everything while he was here on this earth, right? He was. And he was in control this last week of his life, the last couple of days, the last couple of hours. He was in control. He was in control in the garden whenever he admitted that he was the one they were looking for, without fighting, without running. He was there. Jesus doesn't need us to defend him in any way. Jesus by himself stands on his own. Stands on his own. But yet he wants us to acknowledge him. He wants us to be a part of his family. He wants us to tell others about him. And those are the principles that we can learn from this. And Jesus didn't get a fair trial. It was waged against him. In other passages, we read where they brought in people to lie about Jesus, to lie about him, so that they could convict him, so that they would see him, what was happening in there. And so sometimes, we can't expect fair trial sometimes from this world, because the world is biased against Christians. And we've seen that in other passages that we've looked at, is that, the world just sometimes isn't the nicest when it comes to Christians. They'll persecute us, they'll do things to us just because we're different, just because we claim the name of Christ. So those are the principles we can learn from this passage. So how can we apply this to our lives here in 2022? Never be caught warming yourself at the fire of Jesus' enemies. Be careful of the people that you're around. Be careful of the people that you are. There are many enemies out there, so you really can't help coming in contact with them. But yet what we can do is, whenever we're around the fire with them, we can proclaim Christ. We can tell them about Christ. We can be Christians to them. We can show that we are committed to truth by obeying God's word, by staying true to what God says, by following what God says in his word. And then remember that the events that were surrounding the death of Christ, they were prophesied in the Old Testament. So we know that fulfillment of that came. And that's what we put our hope and faith in, is that we know that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the one who came to die on the cross for our sins. And that can give us great comfort whenever we go through things. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic week. If you need anything, let me know. My email is down in the description down below if you have any questions. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm praying for you all every day, and I hope you all have a fantastic week.